Hi, my name is Baker Brainard, and this is my final project for architectural theory class. So, the project I'm going to be discussing is a project I did in undergrad at the University of Cincinnati. So, a quick overview of this project: it was a response to COVID-19 studio. Our design challenge was we could design anything we wanted as long as it was in response to COVID-19 pandemic. So, I chose to design a vertical city which would help with quarantine, isolation, any future pandemic, really. Seeing how huge cities like New York shut down during the pandemic, trying to design a city that wouldn't have to do that, could track people going in, going out. So my project was a vertical city with tons of apartment units on the facade of the building with a large void in the center. The void in the center contained blocks that would be any kind of programming, really. Public institutions, park and green space, office space, commercial space, any public amenity that the city would need. And then with the facade being the apartments or with residential space. I designed my project this way to deal with basically one large vertical city, which, if another pandemic hit, they would basically already be in quarantine. They're already with the inhabitants of their city in this one large structure. So anything that's going on outside in the outside world, as long as it doesn't get into this structure, into this building, the people in here are safe from infection or any future pandemic. So you'll see here my first floor plan with the large green space in the center, entrances on the top and bottom, and apartment and residential spaces on the left and right. Same place for the typical floor plan up the building, except for in the middle now you see those blocks which would contain those public institutions, any amenity space that the city would need. Moving on to apartment unit floor plans, which isn't really important. Research for how a city actually occupies its space based on the size of the city, going from less than 50,000, 50,000 to 250,000, and then over 250,000 on the right. Next would be an example of those public institutions and commercial spaces: schools, libraries, government offices, doctors' offices for public institutions, and commercial spaces: restaurants, movie theaters, grocery stores, bars, clubs, retail spaces, cafes, gyms, and other sports facilities. Just an example of a convenience store and a restaurant, an example of the floating block roof park, and then elevations of my building itself. The theory I want to talk about specifically in relation to my project is from Module 4, The City, from the reading The Contemporary European Urban Project, Archipelago City, Diffuse City, and Reverse City by Paola Vigano. In the reading, Paula talks about how cities are broken up into fragments, basically different sectors and zones. You can think about that as different neighborhoods in large cities, different areas. Most of the time, they don't have ways to actually get to one another. They don't relate to each other. They're kind of just thought of in that way. Sometimes they can be based on past segregation, current segregation, anything really that drew that line to separate in the way that the city is thought about. So I want to talk about how my project actually could increase fragmentation, which is not a good thing. When designing it originally, I imagined it purposely to be separated, to be broken off from wherever it's built. It's a large structure, it's a large vertical city inside of another city, purposely separated from the rest. Thinking about that now, in relation to the pandemic, it was a good idea. In relation to future pandemics, it could be a good idea, but it would increase fragmentation more in the city by basically isolating the people that choose to live in this structure. It could possibly lead to a hierarchy of the ultra wealthy or the people who can afford to be safe from a future pandemic could live here. One of the main problems with fragmentation of a city is that people become disconnected from each other, isolated. They kind of detach from the overall image and pride, camaraderie of the city itself. And I believe my project would further that by, it is purposely isolating, but by doing that, isolating everybody who lives in this structure from the surrounding city of wherever it would be built. Part of the reason I designed the city this way, and this does relate to fragmentation, is I had the idea of a 15-minute city in my head, everything that you could need within a 15-minute walk or bike, any means of transportation that's not a car. Um, but the problem with 15-minute cities, I believe, is that it would fragment the city more. If you have everything that you need within a 15-minute radius, you are isolating yourself. You're rarely ever leaving outside of that radius, to commune with other people in your city, to go to different areas, to really get out and explore in the city that you inhabit and live in. So I believe that 15-minute cities, while a good idea and approachable in sustainable design and people's lives' well-being and how people their happiness in a city, but 15-minute cities would further fragment a city into smaller sectors, isolating people even further than they already are. One of the solutions to fragmentation thought of in the 1950s and 60s in Italy was to think of cities as regions, very similar to the megalopolis here in the eastern side of the US, at north, most consisting of Boston, and at south and Washington, D.C., with cities like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore in between them, comprising this megalopolis. And those bigger cities, like the ones I listed before, would be the hearts of that megalopolis. To think of it in regions like that. I don't think that would solve my project's problems very much. To think about them as their own like hubs of a city because it is so isolated in itself. So I guess that would be a design problem. But we know now that thinking of cities and regions like that helps to push sprawl, urban sprawl, which is not necessarily a good thing. It increases pollution, and decreases happiness in people's lives with their commute to wherever they need to go. It increases reliance on automobiles. Um, so we know now that that isn't necessarily a good solution to the problem. We know now one of the ways to help solve fragmentation is to reconnect those different urban sectors and zones through existing infrastructure, such as the High Line in New York City or the Cheon Yechon Stream in Seoul, or through public transportation, but not through highways or automobiles. Because highways are a main contributor to fragmentation in cities, specifically North American cities, by the way that different neighborhoods were completely demolished, destroyed, and then broken off and separated by the construction of highways. Extremely bad examples would be Cincinnati and Miami specifically. In relation to my building in terms of solving fragmentation, I obviously public transportation is not an option considering it is one large vertical city unless it was public transportation specifically to this structure from other places in the city. But of course, that would go against the actual design problem that was given to me when designing this in the first place. So I think that the isolation itself is the problem in terms of fragmentation and only really making this worse. So I believe that maybe an option would be to connect this structure to other large structures in the city that may possibly be too futuristic. But of course, the structure itself is a futuristic idea that would probably never be built just in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But this was my final project. Thank you so much.